Hi, I'm Jenny Scott. I'm a Senior Advisor in FDA's Office of Food Safety at the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. And I'm going to give you an overview of our current good manufacturing practice, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive controls for human food rule. This chapter serves as a review of many of the things that you've already covered, because in each chapter we did present what the regulatory requirements are. However, there are some aspects of the rule that aren't covered in the chapters. So we're going to go very quickly through the parts that have already been covered and just let them serve as a review for you. But we'll go into a little bit more in depth about the things that haven't been covered. And this overview will also help you to navigate the rule when you want to find something. So the objective of this regulation overview is to develop an awareness of the requirements of the current good manufacturing practice, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive controls for human food regulation. The current good manufacturing practice, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive controls for human food regulation is found in 21 CFR Part 117. And it has 7 subparts as shown here. First, there are general provisions in Subpart A. Then in Subpart B, we have our current good manufacturing practice requirements. These were formerly in 21 CFR Part 110. Subpart C is the requirement for hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. And Subpart D are the modified requirements. These are the ones that apply to a qualified facility and to a facility that's holding prepackaged refrigerated foods. Subpart E deals with the withdrawal of a qualified facility exemption. And Subpart E are the requirements applying to records that must be established and maintained. Subpart G is the supply chain program. So who's covered by this regulation? Well, first let me say that it's a prohibited act for facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold food for sale in the United States that are required to comply with 418 to operate if they are not in compliance with Section 418 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act or with Subparts C, D, E, or F of Part 117. Section 418 and Subparts C, D, E, and F of Part 117 apply to facilities that are required to register with FDA under Section 415 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Registration is not required for farms or for retail food establishments. The regulation applies to both domestic facilities and to foreign facilities that export food for consumption in the United States. There are a number of exemptions and modified requirements, most of these with respect to Subpart C on hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. Section 117.4 has the requirements for training that are applicable to all establishments that manufacture, process, pack, or hold food. Individuals must have the education, training, experience, or a combination of these necessary to manufacture, process, pack, or hold clean and safe food as appropriate to the individual's assigned duties. Individuals must receive training in the principles of food hygiene and food safety as appropriate to the food, the facility, and the individual's assigned duties. And records are required for food hygiene and food safety training as appropriate. There are a number of exemptions and modified requirements, as I indicated before, and the first of these is for qualified facilities. Qualified facilities are exempt from the requirements for hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls when certain documentation is provided. The regulation provides 2 ways in which a facility can qualify for this exemption. The facility can be a very small business, which is a business including affiliates and subsidiaries that average less than $1 million in total annual sales of human food, plus the market value of human food held without sale, for example, held for a fee, as in the case of a warehouse. The other way in which a facility can be a qualified facility is to have food sales averaging less than $500,000 per year during the last 3 years, and have sales to qualified end users, which are consumers or restaurants and retail food establishments within the same state or within 275 miles. The sales to these qualified end users have to exceed sales to all others. So as you can see, qualified facilities will generally qualify by being very small businesses. There are other exemptions and modified requirements, some of which are shown in this slide. For example, There's an exemption for foods subject to FDA's HACCP regulations. That's seafood under Part 123 and juice under Part 120. Also foods subject to our low acid canned foods regulation with respect to the microbiological hazards. But if the canned foods have physical or chemical hazards, then the facility would have to have a food safety plan for those. There's an exemption for dietary supplements that are in compliance with Part 111. However, dietary ingredients are covered by this rule. And there's also an exemption for alcoholic beverages. Facilities such as warehouses that only store unexposed packaged food are not subject to the requirements for hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls in Subpart C or the supply chain program requirements in Subpart G. However, they may be subject to modified requirements for temperature controls in Subpart D, that is Section 117.206, if any of the packaged food requires time temperature control to significantly minimize or prevent the growth of or toxin production by pathogens. And the CGMP requirements of Subpart B still apply. Certain storage facilities, such as grain elevators and warehouses that only store raw agricultural commodities other than fruits and vegetables intended for further distribution or processing, are exempt from the requirements for hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. Facilities such as warehouses that store raw agricultural commodities that are fruits and vegetables are not exempt from the hazard analysis and risk-based controls requirements. This is a statutory provision in FSMA. 21 CFR 117 Subpart B, the GMPs, does not apply to farms and activities of farm mixed-type facilities, to fishing vessels, to establishments solely engaged in holding or transportation of raw agricultural commodities, and establishments solely engaged in hulling, shelling, drying, packing, and or holding of nuts without additional processing. This is based on an existing provision in the GMPs in 21 CFR 110.19a, known as the RAC exemption, RAC standing for Raw Agricultural Commodities. GMPs do apply to packaging, packing, and holding of certain dried raw agricultural commodities, such as raisins made from grapes. Compliance may be achieved by complying with Subpart B of the or the applicable requirements for packing and holding in Part 112, the Produce Safety Standards. A similar approach can be applied to off-farm packaging, packing, and holding of produce raw agricultural commodities, which are subject to the GMPs. Subparts C and G do not apply to farms, since they're not required to register, or to activities of a facility that are subject to the produce safety regulations in Part 112. Farm mixed-type facilities are establishments that are farms, but they also conduct activities outside the farm definition that require registration. However, certain low-risk manufacturing, processing, packing, and holding activities conducted on specific foods by small or very small businesses on farms are exempt from Subparts C and G. But that's only if these are the only activities that they conduct that requires them to register. The regulation includes the full list. It is a comprehensive list, and it's based on a qualitative risk assessment that's informed by public comment. There is a list in G for packing and holding processed human food, and one for manufacturing and processing of human foods in H. Examples include making maple syrup or maple candy and milling grains to make flours. The different sections of Subparts B, the CGMPs, are shown in this slide. All but one of these were found in 21 CFR 110. The new provision is 117.95, and these are the GMPs for holding and distribution of human food byproducts for animal food, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a minute. 21 CFR 117 also includes updated current good manufacturing practices. These clarify that protection of food against contamination also includes protection against allergen cross-contact. The rule also updates the language, changing shalls to musts, and certain provisions containing recommendations, and these were provisions that said should before or compliance may be achieved by, were deleted, but others were made mandatory, such as requiring the cleaning of non-food contact surfaces as frequently as necessary to protect against allergen cross-contact and contamination of food contact surfaces, and food packaging. Provisions were also added for the holding and distribution of human food byproducts for use as animal food. The holding and distribution of human food byproducts for use as animal food is not subject to the preventive controls for animal food regulation if the human food facility complies with the human food GMPs and does not further manufacture the byproducts. Facilities that hold and distribute human food byproducts for use as animal food must comply with 21 CFR 117.95, which essentially involves preventing contamination of the byproducts used for animal food. Now, the primary focus of this training program is on 21 CFR 117 subpart C, the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. Each facility is required to implement a food safety plan that focuses on preventing hazards in foods. That's found in 21 CFR 117.126. And the other provisions listed here describe the components of the food safety plan. The first requirement in establishing a food safety plan is to conduct a hazard analysis. The hazard analysis must be written even if the facility does not identify any hazards requiring a preventive control. The identification of hazards requires consideration of biological, chemical, including radiological, and physical hazards that may be associated with the facility and the food. The hazards may occur naturally, may be unintentionally introduced, or they may be intentionally introduced for economic gain. The purpose of the hazard evaluation is to determine if the known or reasonably foreseeable hazards require a preventive control. The evaluation includes an assessment of the severity of the illness or injury if the hazard were to occur, and the probability that the hazard will occur in the absence of preventive controls. Potential contamination from the food handling environment must be considered for ready-to-eat foods that are exposed to the environment prior to package if the packaged food does not receive a treatment or otherwise include a control measure such as a formulation lethal for the pathogen that would significantly minimize the pathogen. A hazard evaluation must consider the effect of the following on the safety of the finished food for the intended consumer. These include the formulation of the food, the facility and the equipment, raw materials and other ingredients, transportation practices, manufacturing and processing procedures, packaging and labeling activities, storage and distribution, the intended or reasonably foreseeable use, sanitation, including employee hygiene, and other relevant factors, such as weather-related concerns in regard to formation of some natural toxins, such as mycotoxins. The preventive controls required depend on which, if any, hazards are determined to require preventive control. Preventive controls for the identified hazard may be process controls, food allergen controls, sanitation controls, supply chain controls, a recall plan, and any other controls. And these preventive controls may or may not be at critical control points. And that's a very important point to remember. Preventive controls are not required for food in which a hazard has been identified under two circumstances. First, the type of food could not be consumed without applying an appropriate control, for example, coffee beans or cocoa beans. And a facility relies on a customer or other entity later in the food chain to ensure that the identified hazard is significantly minimized or prevented. The facility must disclose that the food is not processed to control the identified hazard, and they have to specify what that hazard is. And they have to obtain assurances, as specified in the rule, that the hazard will be controlled. A facility that's providing the type of written assurance described must document the action taken to control the hazard. That's in 117.137. A recall plan is required when a hazard requiring a preventive control is identified for a food. It includes written procedures to follow with respect to notifying the direct consignees of the food being recalled, notifying the public when that's appropriate to protect public health, conducting effectiveness checks to verify that the recall is carried out effectively, and the appropriate disposition of the recalled food. Preventive control management components, that's monitoring, corrective actions or corrections, and verification activities, apply as appropriate to ensure the effectiveness of the preventive controls, taking into account the nature of the preventive control and its role in the facility's food safety system. For supplier preventive controls, only certain components are applicable, as shown in this slide. As appropriate to the nature of the preventive control and its role in the facility's food safety system, facilities must have written procedures for monitoring, and the monitoring must be documented in records subject to verification. In some cases, for example, refrigeration temperature, records may be created only when a limit is exceeded, showing a loss of control. These are called exception records. As appropriate to the nature of the preventive control and its role in the facility's food safety system, a facility must also have corrective action procedures to identify and correct a problem with implementation of a preventive control, to reduce the likelihood it will happen again, to evaluate any affected food for safety, and to ensure that adulterated food does not enter into commerce. Corrective action records are required. Corrective action procedures are required to address the detection of a pathogen or appropriate indicator organism in a ready-to-eat product, and to respond to the presence of environmental pathogens or appropriate indicator organisms detected through environmental monitoring. The response may vary as appropriate to the nature of the preventive control and its role in the food safety system, again. So all of these corrective actions may not be needed because all of these activities may not be needed. If there is an unanticipated problem and a specific corrective action procedure has not been established, or if a preventive control is found to be ineffective, the food safety plan must be reanalyzed to determine whether it should be modified. In some situations, such as those mentioned in this slide, you may use corrections in place of corrective action if you take action in a timely manner to identify and correct a minor or isolated problem that doesn't directly impact product safety. Records should be kept as appropriate when corrections are made. Verification activities include, as appropriate to the nature of the preventive control and its role in the facility's food safety system, validation, verification that monitoring is being conducted, verification that corrective actions are appropriate, verification of implementation of and effectiveness, such as calibration, product testing, environmental monitoring, and a review of records, as well as reanalysis. Validation involves obtaining and evaluating scientific and technical evidence that the preventive control will effectively control the hazard. Generally, this will involve validating process controls because we don't require validation of allergen controls, food, sanitation controls, or the recall plan, or the supplier controls. Generally, this must be done or overseen by a preventive controls qualified individual prior to implementation or within 90 days of production, because sometimes you have to do in-plant activities to determine that you can effectively deliver the process. Longer time frames may be acceptable with written justification by the preventive controls qualified individual. The regulation specifies that validation is not needed for allergen controls, sanitation controls, the recall plan, and the supply chain program. So again, that means process controls do need to be validated. Verification of implementation and effectiveness includes, as appropriate to the facility, the food, and the nature of the preventive control, activities such as calibration, product testing, environmental monitoring, and records review. A review of monitoring and corrective action records is required within 7 working days after the record was created, unless a preventive controls qualified individual prepares or oversees a written justification for a longer, reasonable time frame. Calibration records, product testing records, and environmental monitoring records, when applicable, must be reviewed within a reasonable time after the records were created. And a review of relevant supplier and supply chain verification records is also required within a reasonable time frame. Written procedures are required for calibrating, monitoring, and verification equipment, including the frequency of calibration. When product testing is required, scientifically valid procedures must be used and identified. Written procedures must identify the test microorganism or analytes, how the sample relates to the lot, the number and frequency of taking samples, the test conducted, and the methods used, as well as the laboratory conducting the test, and corrective action procedures for results that do not meet the requirements. Similar procedures are required when environmental monitoring is required. Reanalysis of the food safety plan is another verification activity. The full plan must be reviewed at least every 3 years to ensure that it still accurately reflects the preventive controls needed. FDA may also determine that reanalysis is necessary in response to new hazards and developments in scientific understanding. Reanalysis of applicable sections of the plan is also required when there's a significant change in the operation or in current knowledge that may increase concern regarding a new or previously identified hazard. Reanalysis may also be required after an unanticipated food safety problem occurs or when preventive controls or a combination of preventive controls or the food safety plan itself is ineffective. When reanalysis is conducted, in most cases it must take place before any changes are made in the food safety plan. When necessary to demonstrate control measures can be implemented as designed, validation activities needed as a result of reanalysis may take place in the first 90 days of production. The basis for concluding that no revision is necessary must be documented, and a preventive controls qualified individual must perform or oversee the reanalysis of the food safety plan. So this slide shows the requirements for a preventive control qualified individual. A preventive controls qualified individual is required to, among other things, develop or oversee the preparation of the food safety plan, the validation of preventive controls, the review of records, and a reanalysis of the food safety plan. Additional tasks that must be performed or overseen by the preventive controls qualified individual involve written justification in situations where the expected time frames for certain activities are not met. These include justification for completing validation activities after 90 days of first production, or determining that validation is not required, justification for review of monitoring and corrective action records exceeding 7 working days, and determining that it is appropriate to perform reanalysis and validation of additional preventive controls in a period longer than the first 90 days of production. There are 2 ways to become a preventive controls qualified individual. The first way is to successfully complete training in the development and application of risk-based preventive controls, such as attending this training class and successfully completing the exercises. Training must be documented in records, including the date, type of training, and the person trained. The second way is for an individual to be qualified through job experience to develop and implement a food safety plan. There are many people out there who've been trained in HACCP and have been implementing HACCP plans, and they probably can become a qualified individual simply by learning the requirements of this preventive controls rule. Audits must be conducted by a qualified auditor. Qualified auditors must have the technical expertise obtained by education, training, experience, or a combination of these in the auditing function. Qualified auditors include government employees, auditors associated with certification bodies, or even employees of a receiving facility. Second-party audits are acceptable, provided that the auditor is qualified. And the training for auditors must be documented in records. Section 117.190 is a list of records that are required by Subpart C for implementation of the Food Safety Plan. All of the requirements to keep these records have been covered in previous sections, so this is just a refresher list for you and make it easy for you to understand what the applicable records are. Subpart D contains the provisions for modified requirements that apply to a qualified facility and that apply to a facility that's solely engaged in the storage of unexposed packaged food that requires time temperature control for safety. Qualified facilities will need to be familiar with the requirements in 117.201, but we don't go through them in this course. For facilities that store refrigerated packaged food, such as refrigerated storage warehouses, there are requirements for time temperature control if a product can support pathogen growth or toxin production. These include monitoring temperatures and taking corrective actions when appropriate. Verification activities related to temperature monitoring also apply. Subpart E describes the provisions for withdrawal of the exemption of a qualified facility, as well as for reinstatement of their qualified exemption. Qualified facilities should be familiar with these provisions, but we're not going to go through them in this course. Subpart F contains the requirements that apply to required records. These were covered in the records chapter, but all facilities required to keep records should pay attention to this subpart. which pretty much means all facilities, because all facilities need to keep some type of record. For example, every facility has to train their employees in food hygiene and food safety and would have a record of that. Hazards requiring a preventive control for which a manufacturer or processor relies on supplier efforts are managed through a supply chain program. 21 CFR 117 subpart G covers the requirements to establish and implement a supply chain program. It includes general requirements, responsibilities of the receiving facility, using approved suppliers, determining appropriate supplier verification activities, conducting those activities, on-site audits, and records required for a supply chain program. So you went over these in depth in the supply chain program chapter. However, just as a quick review, a supply chain program is only required to address those ingredients and raw materials that present potential hazards requiring a supply chain applied control. That is, the hazard is controlled before receipt of the raw material or other ingredient. To avoid duplicative requirements, an importer in compliance with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program does not need to comply with the supplier verification activities of the Preventive Controls Rule. The supplier program does not apply to food for research or evaluation use, but specific conditions apply, such as labeling the food as food for research or evaluation use. The supply chain program must be written, and records are required to demonstrate that the program is implemented. The supply chain program requires the use of approved suppliers for ingredients in which control has been applied prior to receipt. Only the receiving facility can approve suppliers. This is important to remember. The receiving facility must determine the appropriate supplier verification activities and then conduct and document those activities. However, there is flexibility for others in the distribution chain to conduct supplier verification activities. When a supply chain applied control is applied by an entity other than the receiving facility's supplier, for example, when a non-supplier applies controls to certain produce, for example, produce subject to the produce safety rule, because growing, harvesting, and packing activities are under different management, the receiving facility must verify the supply chain applied control or obtain documentation of appropriate verification activity from another entity and review and assess the entity's applicable documentation and document that review and assessment. An example is when a receiving facility receives produce from a supply chain that includes a separate grower, harvester, and packer. The grower is the supplier, and the requirements of subpart G applicable to suppliers apply to the grower. However, the receiving facility may need to verify or obtain information on verification of controls by a harvester or a packer. On-site audits, sampling and testing, and a review of the relevant food safety records are appropriate supplier verification activities for raw materials or other ingredients requiring a supply chain applied control. However, there may be other supplier verification activities that could be applicable. In determining which approach to use, a facility would have to consider the results of the hazard analysis, including the nature of the hazard requiring a supply chain applied control, the supplier's procedures, processes, and practices related to the safety of the ingredient, relevant FDA food safety regulations, and information such as warning letters and import alerts related to the food and the supplier's compliance with these, the supplier's food safety history, including applicable test results, audit results, responses to correcting problems, and other things that are known about the supplier, and storage and transportation practices. In summary, the current good manufacturing practice, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive controls for human food regulation is intended to focus preventive controls where they matter the most. GMPs are required for all facilities unless an exemption exists. And this course focuses on 21 CFR 117 subpart C, the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls for human foods, and subpart G, the supply chain program. More detailed information on other provisions can be obtained through other means, such as reading the regulation, which is found in Appendix 1, through other training programs, or through legal counsel. Now, to wrap up, I just want to remind you that Chapter 7 discussed the FSPCA and FDA technical assistance networks and provided the links to both the FSPCA website and the FDA website. These networks will work together with FDA addressing answers to regulation and policy interpretation questions, FSPCA addressing scientific and technical questions, and there will be interaction of the two as appropriate. I'd like to now turn it over to Kathy Gambas to explain how to submit a question to FDA's Technical Assistance Network. Thank you.